The air in the Boulder law office was thick with greed as the reading of my grandfather's will began. I walked in straight from Fort Liberty, my combat fatigues and campaign medals clashing sharply with the room's designer suits. My father Calvin didn't offer a hug, he offered a sneer. "She's just playing soldier while we do the real work." He barked at the relatives, dismissing my years of service as a mere game. When I calmly refused to sign away my inheritance to my spoiled brother Julian, my father's mask of civility shattered. He lunged forward, his palm cracking across my face in a stinging blow that echoed through the sudden silence. I didn't flinch. As I stood slowly adjusting my uniform, lawyer Martin Hale cleared his throat. "Mr. Ashford, before you continue," Hale whispered, "do you actually know who legally owns the $13.4 million mansion you're currently living in?" Before I tell you what happened after my father slapped me in the middle of my grandfather's will reading, if stories about family betrayal, hidden truths, and quiet justice speak to you, consider liking and subscribing. Thank you for being here and sharing this moment with me. My father's laughter was a dry, hollow sound that filled the tense silence of the law office. He leaned back in his leather chair, the sting of his palm still burning on my cheek. Yet he looked at me with the smug satisfaction of a man who thought he had already won. To him, I was still the rebellious daughter who had wasted her life in the mud of foreign battlefields instead of building the family empire. "Ownership," Calvin sneered, glancing around at the relatives as if sharing a private joke. "The Ashford estate has been the crown jewel of this family for 30 years, Hale. My father built it, I maintained it, and my son will inherit it. Don't waste our time with riddles. My daughter is a guest in that house, a guest who has clearly overstayed her welcome." He looked at me, then his eyes cold and dismissive. "Sign the papers, Rowan. Take your army pension and go back to your tents. You don't belong in a house of this stature." Beside me, Martin Hale didn't flinch. He didn't even look up at first. With a slow, methodical grace, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, leather-bound folder. The heavy thud it made as he dropped it onto the mahogany table sounded like a gavel bringing a court to order. "Mr. Ashford." Hale began, his voice dropping an octave. "History is often written by those who hold the deeds, not those who pay the utility bills." He flipped open the folder, revealing a series of notarized documents stamped with the official seal of the state of Colorado. He adjusted his spectacles and began to read, his voice clear and resonant. "Pursuant to the Langford-Ashford Irrevocable Trust established 14 years ago by the late Theodore Langford, the primary residential asset located at Lookout Mountain, commonly referred to as the Ashford Mansion, was severed from the general estate." Calvin frowned, his posture stiffening. "What are you talking about? That's impossible." Hale ignored the interruption. "The deed was transferred into a protected trust naming a singular absolute beneficiary, according to the title registry and the final codicil of the will." Hale paused, looking directly at me for the first time, a flicker of something like pride in his eyes. "The legal rightful and sole owner of the $13.4 million estate is Major Rowan Ashford." The room didn't just go quiet. It felt as if the oxygen had been sucked out of it. Then, like a dam breaking, the relatives erupted. My aunts began whispering frantically, their eyes darting between me and my father. Julian, who had been lounging smugly in the corner, sat bolt upright, his face draining of color. I felt a strange cold sensation wash over me. I looked at the papers, my mind racing. I was a combat surgeon. I was trained to handle chaos, to make split-second decisions when blood was spilling and lives were on the line. But this was a different kind of battlefield. I looked at my hands, calloused from surgery and grit, and realized my grandfather had seen something in me even back then. 14 years ago, I was just a girl leaving for basic training. He had seen the storm coming, and he had built me a fortress before I even knew I needed one. Calvin's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He slammed his fists onto the table, the force rattling the crystal water carafes. "That is a lie, a fabrication." He roared, his voice cracking with desperation. I am his son. I've managed that property. I've hosted every board meeting and gala in that ballroom for a decade. You're telling me my father gave my home to her, a girl who hasn't stepped foot in the state for years. He didn't give her a home, Calvin, Hale replied sharply, standing up to meet my father's gaze. He gave her security. He knew your spending habits, and he knew Julian's lack of discipline. He placed this asset along with several others into an irrevocable trust. For those of you who don't understand the legalities, that means it cannot be contested, it cannot be sold by anyone other than the beneficiary, and it is entirely shielded from your personal debts. I stood there still feeling the faint throb of the slap on my face, but the pain was being replaced by a surging sense of clarity. I looked at the man who had just struck me, who had tried to humiliate me in front of everyone we knew. He was no longer the imposing patriarch of the Ashford family. In the light of the truth, he looked small. He looked like a squatter in a house that belonged to the daughter he had tried to disown. Rowan. My father stammered, his tone shifting from rage to a sickening, oily plea. Rowan, honey, there's been a mistake. We need to sit down and talk about this. You know your brother needs that penthouse for his business and the mansion. The mansion is the face of our company. You wouldn't actually kick your own father out, would you? I didn't answer him immediately. I let the silence hang heavy and suffocating. I adjusted the lapel of my uniform, feeling the weight of my medals. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. Honor is more important than money. Theodore didn't make a mistake, father. I said, my voice as steady as a scalpel. He made a choice. And now, for the first time in 30 years, so will I. The law office cleared out like a battlefield after a ceasefire, tense, silent, and thick with the scent of defeat. My father and Julian had stormed out, their faces twisted in a mixture of disbelief and calculated rage. I could still hear my father's raised voice echoing in the hallway, barking orders into his phone, likely calling every high-priced attorney in Denver to see if irrevocable actually meant what it said. Major Ashford, if you could stay for a moment. Martin Hale said, his voice cutting through my spinning thoughts. He gestured toward the high-backed leather chair I had been standing beside. The theater is over. Now we need to discuss the reality. I sat down, the weight of my uniform feeling heavier than usual. I thought the mansion was the reality, Martin. It's more than I ever expected. Hale offered a thin, knowing smile as he opened a second, even thicker briefcase. The mansion is merely the gates to the kingdom, Rowan. Your grandfather knew that if he revealed everything at once, your father might have caused a scene that even the police couldn't settle. Theodore was a strategist. He didn't just want to give you a home, he wanted to give you an empire. He began sliding documents across the mahogany table one by one. Each paper felt like a lightning bolt. In addition to the Lookout Mountain estate, Hale began, the trust includes a fully occupied 18-unit apartment complex in Aurora. It's been managed by a third-party firm for years, generating a steady six-figure net income. Then there are the commercial holdings, 2 prime parcels of undeveloped land in the heart of the Denver Tech Center. Developers have been trying to buy those for a decade, but Theodore refused to budge. He knew the value would skyrocket. My breath hitched as I looked at the maps and the tax assessments. But Hale wasn't finished. And finally, he said, placing a bank statement on top of the pile, the liquid assets. A diversified investment fund currently valued at $3.1 million. When you combine the real estate, the commercial land, and the cash reserves, your total inheritance is valued at approximately $22 million. $22 million. The number felt abstract, impossible. I had spent the last decade living out of a rucksack, sleeping in tents, and earning an army salary that barely covered my student loans. I measured value in lives saved and successful surgeries, not in property tax and investment portfolios. Why? I managed to whisper. Why me? Why not divide it? even a small portion would have saved my father's pride. Hale leaned forward, his expression softening. Theodore spent 30 years watching Calvin. He watched him burn through his mother's inheritance. He watched him gamble on failed tech startups and leverage his own dignity for the sake of looking wealthy. Your grandfather knew that giving Calvin money was like pouring water into a sieve. He didn't trust Calvin to lead the family, and he certainly didn't trust Julian to grow up. Hale reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a cream-colored envelope sealed with wax. My name was written on the front in my grandfather's shaky but elegant script. He told me to give you this only when the others had left, Hale said. He knew exactly how today would go. I opened the letter with trembling fingers. The scent of his old study tobacco and aged paper seemed to drift from the pages. My dearest Rowan, if you are reading this, it means I am gone and the wolves have already begun to circle. I watched you leave for the army when you were barely more than a child. I watched you choose a path of service and sacrifice, while your father and brother chose the path of least resistance. You were the only one who called Rowan. From Iraq, from Syria, from North Carolina, you called not to ask for an inheritance, but to ask how my garden was growing. You gave me your time, which is the only currency that truly matters. I have left you everything because you are the only one with the character to protect it. Use this power to build the life you deserve, a life away from their shadows. Do not let them guilt you. Do not let them break you. My eyes blurred as I reached the final line written in bold, heavy ink. If you are reading this letter, it means they have already tried to take everything from you. Don't let them. I folded the letter carefully, tucked it into my uniform pocket, and looked at the lawyer. The sting on my cheek from my father's slap was gone, replaced by a cold surgical focus. My grandfather hadn't just left me money, he had left me a mission. And in the army, we never fail the mission. Martin, I said, my voice dropping the tone of a grieving granddaughter and taking on the authority of a major. I need a full audit of every cent my father has touched in the last 5 years. If he's been living in my house, I want to know exactly what he's been doing with the keys. I steered my rugged SUV out of the downtown Boulder parking lot, but my mind wasn't on the road. As I headed south toward the foothills, the familiar manicured landscapes of Colorado began to blur into the ghosts of my past. To anyone else, the name Cherry Hills Village evoked images of sprawling estates, elite country clubs, and ultimate prestige. To me, it was the place where I learned that love was a transaction I could never afford. As the engine hummed, I was pulled back to our family home, a Mediterranean-style villa, where the sunlight always seemed to shine exclusively on my younger brother Julian. In the Ashford household, Julian was the sun, and we were all expected to orbit him. I remembered his 18th birthday clearly. While I was tucked away in my room studying for the MCATs, I heard the roar of an engine from the driveway. My father had bought him a brand new silver Porsche 911. Not because Julian had earned it, he had barely scraped through his high school graduation, but because an Ashford man needs to look the part. That was the theme of our lives. Julian was sent to the most prestigious private academies, his tuition paid without a second thought. When he decided he wanted to be an entrepreneur at 22, my father cut a check for $500,000 to fund a tech startup that failed within 6 months. There were no consequences, no lectures on responsibility. There was only the endless fountain of my father's pride and bank account. I, on the other hand, existed in the periphery. While Julian got the Porsche, I spent my weekends working at a local clinic and filling out endless financial aid forms. I knew early on that if I wanted a future, I would have to build the foundation myself. My father viewed my academic drive not as a virtue, but as a nuisance. To him, my intelligence was a threat to the hierarchy he had established. The breaking point came the night I sat them down in the formal dining room to announce my acceptance into medical school through the Army's HPSP program. I was beaming, holding the acceptance letter that promised a full scholarship and a commission as an officer. My father didn't even look up from his steak. He just let out a short, mocking laugh that felt like a bucket of ice water. A military doctor, he sneered, finally meeting my eyes with pure derision. Rowan, don't be absurd. Ashford women marry into power or they work in the family's philanthropic wing. They do not go off to play soldier in the dirt. It's embarrassing. It's not playing, Dad. I countered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. It's surgery. It's trauma care. It's serving something bigger than this zip code. It's a waste, he snapped, slamming his hand on the table. If you go through with this, don't expect a dime from me. An Ashford daughter doesn't wear a uniform. You'll be nothing more than a glorified nurse in a tent. He kept his word. While he continued to fund Julian's lavish lifestyle and networking trips to Ibiza, I worked 3 jobs to cover the costs the scholarship didn't reach. I lived on ramen and secondhand textbooks while my brother's Instagram was a highlight reel of the wealth I was systematically denied. The memory that stung the most, the one that hardened the core of my soul, was the day I actually left for basic training. I had my duffel bag packed by the front door at 4 a.m. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that the reality of my departure would finally crack his cold exterior. I waited in the foyer for 20 minutes. My grandfather Theodore was there. He hugged me tight, his eyes misty, and pressed a crumpled envelope with $600 into my hand. Money I later found out he had saved from his personal allowance because my father had frozen his access to larger funds. "Go be great, Rowan," he had whispered, but my father, he never even came downstairs. I looked up at the darkened window of his master suite. He was awake, I could see the glow of his bedside lamp. He just chose not to say goodbye. He stayed in his room, dismissing my entire existence because I had refused to be the submissive socialite he could control. Driving now, I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The slap he had given me in the law office wasn't the first time he had tried to hurt me, but I realized then that it would be the last. He thought he had discarded a glorified nurse, but he was about to find out that he had actually challenged a combat surgeon who knew exactly how to cut out a tumor. I turned the car toward Lookout Mountain. I wasn't just going to the house I now owned. I was going to reclaim the decade of respect they had stolen from me. In the cold, sterile world of the Ashford family, my grandfather Theodore was the only source of warmth I ever knew. He was a man of quiet strength, a stark contrast to the loud, ego-driven vacuum that was my father. While Calvin measured a person's worth by the brand of their watch or the horsepower of their car, Grandpa Theodore measured it by the calluses on their hands and the integrity of their word. The morning I left for basic training, the house felt like a tomb. As I stood in the foyer, my duffel bag slumped against my leg like a heavy secret. The silence from the upstairs landing told me everything I needed to know. My father wasn't coming. But then I heard the slow, rhythmic thud of a cane. Grandpa Theodore appeared from the shadows of the hallway. He looked frailer than he had a month prior, but his eyes were sharp, burning with a pride that my father had never possessed. He didn't offer a lecture or a warning. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pressed a plain white envelope into my palm. It was thin, just $600, but I knew it was all the liquid cash he could scramble together without Calvin's accountants noticing. "Rowan," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper that carried more weight than any shout. "They will tell you that you are throwing your life away. They will tell you that wealth is the only shield against the world. They are wrong." He gripped my hand, his fingers surprisingly strong. "Honor is more important than money. Always." That envelope didn't just pay for my initial supplies, it paid for my resolve. During my years of deployment, when the heat of the desert felt like a physical weight, and the trauma of the ER threatened to break my spirit, I wrote to him. I couldn't call often, and I certainly didn't want to speak to Calvin, so I sent letters. I sent photos of my unit, tired, dusty, but proud, and postcards from every corner of the globe where the army sent me. I never knew if he received them all, as my father usually intercepted the mail to filter out the nonsense. But today, sitting in his old study after the chaos of the will reading, I found the truth. Tucked away in a locked cedar box beneath his desk was every single thing I had ever sent. Every letter, every blurred photo of me in my surgical scrubs, every tattered postcard. He hadn't just kept them, he had organized them by date. The edges of the paper were worn as if he had read them hundreds of times. While I was saving lives and earning my rank, the cedar box was growing heavy with my history. Meanwhile, outside this room, the family fortune was being bled dry. I found receipts scattered in the drawers, outrageous credit card statements for Julian's business trips to Macau, luxury car leases, and bail bonds for accidents my father had hushed up. Calvin had spent the last decade pouring millions into a bottomless pit of Julian's failures, trying to buy a legacy that didn't exist. My grandfather had watched it all silently while holding on to my letters. He knew that while one child was spending the family's past, the other was out in the world earning its future. I closed the cedar box, the scent of wood and old ink filling my lungs. My father thought he had won by ignoring me. He had no idea that by casting me out, he had led me straight into the heart of my grandfather's true trust. The drive up Lookout Mountain was a winding path through pine-scented air and breathtaking vistas, but the higher I climbed, the tighter my chest felt. The Ashford Mansion stood at the summit, a sprawling masterpiece of stone and glass that overlooked the Denver skyline. From the outside, it was a monument to old money stability. But as I pulled my SUV into the circular driveway and stepped out, the illusion began to fracture. The lawn was overgrown in patches, and one of the massive stone pillars at the entrance was chipped unrepaired. I used the key Martin Hale had given me, the master key my grandfather had kept hidden from my father. As the heavy oak doors swung open, I wasn't met with the scent of lavender and polished wood I remembered. Instead, the house smelled of stale cigar smoke and neglect. I walked through the foyer, my combat boots echoing on the marble floor. Empty wine bottles sat on the 18th century side tables. Dust filmed the family portraits. It was clear that while my father and Julian lived here, they didn't care for it. They treated this sanctuary like a high-end hotel they had no intention of tipping the staff for. I made my way straight to my grandfather's private study in the north wing. It was the only room my father had been barred from entering by the terms of the trust, or so I thought. When I walked in, I found the drawers of the mahogany desk slightly ajar, as if someone had been frantically searching for something. "Looking for the deed? Weren't you, Calvin?" I whispered to the empty room. I sat in my grandfather's chair and began a systematic search of the room, applying the same methodical precision I used when triaging a trauma patient. It didn't take long to find the wound. Hidden behind a false panel in the lower bookshelf was a stack of manila folders that hadn't been touched by the lawyers yet. As I flipped through the bank statements and legal notices, the blood drained from my face. My father hadn't just been negligent, he had been criminal. I found a series of loan applications dated over the last 3 years. My heart hammered against my ribs as I looked at the signatures at the bottom. It was my grandfather's name written in a shaky hand that looked authentic at first glance, but I knew better. I had seen my grandfather's signature on every birthday card and letter for 20 years. These were forgeries. Clumsy, desperate imitations. Calvin had used these forged signatures to secure 3 separate home equity lines of credit. He had treated the mansion like an ATM to fund Julian's failed ventures and his own gambling debts. The numbers were staggering. The total debt secured against the property exceeded $1.2 million. But the most chilling document was at the bottom of the pile, a notice of default. Because the loans hadn't been serviced in 6 months, the bank was moving toward foreclosure. My father had stayed in this house throwing gala parties and acting like a king, while the walls were literally being repossessed from under him. Then I found the kill shot. It was a fresh contract drafted only 2 weeks ago, sitting in a folder labeled confidential. It was an agreement to transfer the entire property to Julian Ashford for the sum of $1, citing family gift tax exemptions. The plan was clear. Calvin knew the bank was coming. He was trying to shift the asset to Julian, hoping to hide it in a shell company before the foreclosure hit, effectively stealing the house from the trust and leaving the debt behind for the estate to settle. He was going to strip the house bare and leave me with a pile of lawsuits and a $1.2 million hole in the ground. I leaned back, staring at the forged signatures. In the Army, we have a term for this kind of betrayal: fragging. It's when a soldier turns on their own. My father wasn't just a failure. He was a predator. He had bet the family's history on his son's vanity, and he had used a dead man's name to do it. I picked up my phone and dialed Martin Hale. My voice was cold, devoid of the daughter who had once sought her father's approval. "Martin, it's Rowan. Forget the audit. I need a forensic accountant and a private investigator. And I need them at the house tonight. My father didn't just break the rules, he broke the law. And I'm about to court-martial him." I looked at the portrait of my grandfather on the wall. His eyes seemed to urge me on. The wolves weren't just circling. They were inside the house. It was time to clear the perimeter. The grand ballroom of the Ashford mansion was usually reserved for champagne toasts and hollow laughter, but tonight it felt like a military tribunal. I had instructed Martin Hale to summon everyone. I wanted witnesses. I wanted the same audience that had watched my father slap me to watch the curtain fall on his charade. The relatives arrived first, whispering in hushed tones, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. Then came the outsiders, two stone-faced representatives from the bank's fraud department, and a forensic accountant carrying a briefcase that looked like a weapon. My father, Calvin, entered last, flanked by Julian. Despite the looming disaster I had uncovered, he still carried himself with a sickening, unearned confidence. He had changed into a tailored Italian suit, likely bought with money he didn't have. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on me with a mixture of annoyance and condescension. "Rowan, this is getting ridiculous," he said, waving a hand dismissively as he took a seat at the head of the long oak table. "A second meeting. If this is about your ownership of the house, my lawyers are already drafting a correction. You should be back at your base by now." I didn't answer. I stood at the opposite end of the table, still in my uniform, feeling the weight of the forged documents in the folder before me. I looked at Martin Hale and nodded. "Mr. Ashford?" Hale began, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "This meeting isn't about the will. It's about the debt. Specifically, the $1. $2 million in home equity loans secured against this property over the last 36 months. Calvin's posture stiffened, but he didn't lose his smirk. "A temporary liquidity measure, Hale. Standard business practice. The estate will cover it." "The estate cannot cover a crime, Dad," I said, my voice cutting through his bravado like a blade. I opened the folder and slid a stack of high-resolution photocopies across the polished wood. They fanned out like a deck of cards, each one a loan application, each one bearing the shaky, forged signature of my late grandfather. I've spent the last 48 hours doing a deep dive into the archives of this house. I continued, staring directly into his eyes. "I found these in Grandpa's private study, along with the notice of default and the foreclosure warnings you've been hiding from the rest of the family." The room went deathly silent. One of the bank representatives, a woman named Ms. Sterling, stepped forward. She picked up one of the documents and looked at Calvin with a gaze that could freeze fire. "Mr. Ashford," she said, her voice clinical and cold. "Our department has cross-referenced these signatures with the biometric records we have on file from Theodore Langford's final years. These do not match his verified handwriting. Furthermore, these loans were processed through a private portal using an access code that only you possessed as his power of attorney." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. "From the bank's perspective, these are not legitimate loans. This is bank fraud and identity theft on a federal level." We are currently looking at over $1 million in illicitly obtained funds. The crimson color that usually occupied Calvin's face drained away, leaving him a sickly, ghostly gray. He looked around the room, but for the first time no one was nodding in agreement. The relatives were pulling back, literally distancing themselves from him. Even Julian looked like he wanted to vanish into the upholstery. It was for the family. Calvin stammered, his voice jumping an octave. I was protecting our interests. Julian's company needed. Julian's company was a ghost, and you were its only ghostwriter. I interrupted. I stepped closer, leaning my hands on the table. You didn't protect the family. You mortgaged our history to fund a lie. You sat in this house, played the great patriarch, and slapped me across the face for playing soldier while you were playing criminal. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that reached every corner of the ballroom. But here is the ultimate irony, Father. You didn't just forge a dead man's signature. You committed fraud against an asset you had no legal right to touch. You borrowed millions against a house you didn't own. You've been a squatter in my home, spending my inheritance and signing names that weren't yours to sign. Calvin tried to stand, but his knees seemed to buckle. He looked at the bank representatives, then at the relatives, searching for a single ally. He found none. The man who had spent 30 years demanding respect was now left with nothing but the evidence of his own greed lying on the table between us. You're the Dr. Rowan. He gasped, his pride finally breaking into a pathetic plea. You have to help me fix this. We can settle this quietly. I am a doctor, I replied, standing tall. And a doctor knows when a limb is too gangrenous to save. The only thing I'm settling tonight is the truth. The air in the ballroom felt heavy, like the static before a desert storm. Ms. Sterling, the bank representative, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the forged documents with a clinical detachment that seemed to terrify my father more than any scream could. Mr. Ashford, she said, her voice echoing with the weight of federal authority. Because these loans involve the forgery of a deceased individual's signature and the misrepresentation of asset ownership to a federally insured institution, this is no longer a civil matter. The bank has the right and the obligation to refer this case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. We are looking at multiple counts of bank fraud, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The word criminal hit my father like a physical blow. He slumped back into his chair, the Italian silk of his suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He gasped for air, his hands trembling as they clutched the edge of the mahogany table. Prosecution! He choked out, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. No, you don't understand. This was an internal family arrangement. It was a mistake. A clerical error. $1 million clerical error. I countered, my voice flat. You didn't make a mistake, Calvin. You made a bet. And you lost. Suddenly, Julian, who had been hiding in the shadows of the velvet curtains, stepped forward. His usual smug expression was replaced by a mask of desperate righteousness. This is all her fault, he shouted, pointing a shaking finger at me. Rowan has been planning this since she got back. She's been digging through Grandpa's things, twisting the truth to make us look bad. She probably planted those documents. She wants the house for herself so she can sell it and leave us on the street. He turned to the bank representatives, his voice cracking. My father was just trying to keep the lights on because Rowan refused to help with the estate's expenses for years. If anyone is a criminal, it's the daughter who abandoned her family. I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it. But I didn't need to speak. Martin Hale was already reaching into his second briefcase. Actually, Julian Hale said, pulling out a stack of printed digital correspondence. It's interesting you mention abandonment, because these internal email threads from your startup tell a very different story. Hale began to read from the top sheet. An email from Julian Ashford to Calvin Ashford dated 6 months ago. Dad, the bank is asking for Grandpa's updated signature on the equity line. Just use the stamp we made. Once the VC funding hits, we'll pay back the house loan and Rowan will never know the difference. The room went into a deeper, more suffocating silence. Julian's mouth hung open, but no sound came out. "And here's another," Hale continued. "From Calvin to Julian, I've secured the third mortgage. Make sure the lifestyle expenses are categorized as research and development. If your sister asks why the house is in foreclosure, tell her it's a tax dispute." Hale looked up, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. "Not only did you know Julian, but you were the one who suggested the forgery stamp. You weren't a victim of your father's mistakes. You were the architect of the cover-up." The relatives who had been watching the drama like a tennis match finally turned away. The betrayal was too deep, too calculated. My aunts looked at the floor, and my uncles stood with their arms crossed, disgusted by the sheer stupidity of the greed on display. I stepped into the center of the room, reclaiming the space that my uniform demanded. I looked at my father, who was now weeping silently, and my brother, who looked like a ghost. "Enough," I said, and for the first time in that house my word was law. "This ends now." I turned to the bank representatives. "As the sole legal owner of this property and the primary beneficiary of the irrevocable trust, I am officially freezing all accounts associated with the Ashford estate. Any further attempt to draw funds or leverage this house will be met with immediate police intervention." I then looked at my father. "Calvin, you will surrender the keys to the mansion, the Aurora complex, and the commercial parcels to Mr. Hale by midnight. You are no longer the executor. You are no longer the patriarch. You are a tenant on sufferance." For 30 years, Calvin Ashford had ruled our lives with a silver tongue and a heavy hand. But as he sat there, exposed by his own emails and broken by his own lies, his power evaporated. He looked up at me, not with the fire of a father, but with the hollow stare of a man who realized he had just been court-martialed in his own ballroom. "From this moment on," I declared, "this house is under new command, and the first order of business is cleaning out the rot." The ballroom had emptied, leaving only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and the cold, metallic reality of the documents on the table. My father sat slumped in a chair, his head in his hands, while Julian stood by the window, staring out at the Denver lights, as if seeing them for the last time. Martin Hale stepped toward me, his expression grave. "Rowan," he said softly, "the bank's representatives are waiting for your final word. Given the evidence of forgery and the scale of the fraud, a criminal referral is almost a formality at this point. If you give the signal, the district attorney will have them in handcuffs by morning. You have every right legally and morally to let them face the full weight of the law." I looked at the back of my father's head. For a moment I felt the phantom sting of the slap from the law office. I thought about the years of being ignored, the student loans I struggled to pay, and the cold silence on the day I left for war. The major in me wanted justice. The soldier wanted a clean perimeter. But then I reached into my pocket and felt the crinkle of my grandfather's letter. Honor is more important than money, he had written. If I sent my father to prison, the Ashford name, the name Theodore had spent a lifetime building with integrity, would be dragged through the mud of a public scandal. I would be winning a battle but losing the very legacy I was sworn to protect. A surgeon doesn't always amputate. Sometimes the harder task is to debride the wound and force the body to heal. "Wait, Martin," I said, my voice echoing in the vast room. I walked over to the table and looked at my father until he finally raised his tear-streaked face. "I'm not reporting you to the DA," I said. Calvin gasped, a flicker of hope, or perhaps just cowardly relief crossing his features. "Rowan, thank you. I knew you were a good daughter, I knew." "Don't." I cut him off, my voice like ice. "I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for Grandpa. I won't let his name end up in a tabloid headline because of your greed. But make no mistake, your life as you know it is over." I laid out my terms with the same clinical detachment I used when explaining a difficult recovery to a patient. First, I began, You will sell your personal collection of luxury cars and your interest in the country club immediately. Every cent of that money will go toward paying down the $1.2 million debt you saddled this house with. You will work with Martin to liquidate your private assets until the trust is made whole. I then turned my gaze to Julian, who was looking at me with wide, fearful eyes. And Julian, I said, your consulting fees and your allowance are finished. The trust will no longer fund your failures. You will find a job, a real one, and you will move out of the penthouse. If you want a roof over your head, you will earn the rent yourself. From this second forward, you are no longer an Ashford heir. You are just a man with a resume that says you've done nothing for a decade. Calvin looked like he wanted to argue, but the sight of Martin Hale holding the bank's fraud report silenced him. He realized he wasn't being given a choice. He was being given a plea deal. You will live in the gardener's cottage on the edge of the estate, I told my father. It's modest, but it's more than you deserve. You will learn to live on a budget managed by this law firm. If you ever attempt to sign a document or borrow $1 using this family name again, the criminal report will be filed within the hour. I turned back to the lawyer. Martin, draft the settlement. If they don't sign by sunrise, call the police. I walked out of the ballroom, leaving them in the silence of their own making. I didn't feel the rush of revenge I had expected. Instead, I felt the quiet, steady pulse of a mission accomplished. The rot had been cut out. Now the healing, however painful, could begin. The seasons shifted over Lookout Mountain, and with the changing leaves came a transformation that was more than just aesthetic. I spent the summer overseeing the renovation of the mansion. It wasn't about adding more gold leaf or marble, it was about stripping away the pretension. I repaired the crumbling stone pillars, thinned out the overgrown brush, and converted the cold, formal ballroom into a functional community space for veterans' outreach. The house finally felt like it had a heartbeat again, no longer a hollow monument to greed, but a home with a purpose. The restructuring of the family was equally rigorous. Under the watchful eye of a court-appointed financial advisor, my father had spent months liquidating the assets he had once used to flaunt his status. It was a humbling process. Gone were the tailored Italian suits and the vintage wine collection. For the first time in his life, Calvin Ashford had to account for every dollar spent. He lived quietly in the cottage, his days occupied not by social galas, but by the slow, difficult task of rebuilding his own character. Julian's transformation was perhaps the most jarring. True to my word, I cut off his allowance. Stripped of his titles and his safety net, he eventually found work with a commercial construction firm in Denver. He started as a junior site coordinator, trading his designer loafers for steel-toed boots. He looked thinner, more tired, but when I saw him occasionally, there was a new grounded look in his eyes, a flicker of the man he might actually become if he kept his hands in the dirt. By Thanksgiving, the air was crisp, and the mountain peaks were dusted with the first snow of the year. I invited the family back to the mansion. It wasn't the lavish televised affair of years past. It was a simple meal in the renovated dining room. As the evening wound down, my father stood up. He didn't have his usual swagger. He looked older, his face lined with the weight of his realizations. He held up a glass, his hand steady for the first time in years. I've spent most of my life building walls made of paper and lies. He said, his voice quiet but clear. I thought I was the one holding this family together, but I was the one tearing it down. He turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw genuine respect in his eyes. Not because I owned the house, but because I had the strength to save him from himself. My daughter didn't just inherit a fortune. She saved this family. From me. The room remained silent, a heavy but healing peace settling over us. Julian nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the debt he was still working to pay. Later that night, after the guests had retired, I walked into the study. I stood by the large bay window where my grandfather used to sit for hours reading his history books and watching the eagles soar over the canyon. The cedar box containing my letters sat on the desk, a permanent fixture of the room. I looked out at the dark silhouette of the mountains and felt a deep, resonant sense of closure. The major had completed her mission. The surgeon had removed the rot. And the daughter had finally found her way home. The Ashford legacy was no longer a burden of debt and deceit. It was a fortress of honor. Grandpa Theodore was right. Honor is more important than money. And tonight, for the first time in 14 years, this house was finally rich with it.